Today we're going to show you how to remove a CV axle. The first step we're going to do is remove the tie rod end. This cotter pin I'm bending up into place. I want to get it as straight as possible so I can slide it out of the tie rod. After I've bent it straight, I'm going to tap this cotter pin back and grab it with the diagonal cutters and pull the cotter pin out. Next, I'm going to remove the castle nut with an impact socket and impact tool, thread it back into place, and then I'm going to use a sledgehammer to hit the steering knuckle to jar this tie rod loose. After I've jarred it loose, you can see I tapped it up to remove the tie rod. Notice I put the nut on there so that in case I missed the steering knuckle, I didn't damage the stud. Next, I'm going to remove the cotter pin that holds the CV axle into place. I get it straight, pull the cotter pin out through the bottom here, and once I get the cotter pin out, I can remove the retaining clip that holds the nut in place. And then I want to remove the nut on the CV axle. I'm going to use an impact wrench with the socket to remove the CV axle nut. After I've removed the CV axle nut, I'm going to thread it on a couple of revolutions. When I'm pulling on the steering knuckle, it just keeps it in place. Next, I chose to remove the ball joint nuts on the control arm. I can remove the ball joint. I can also remove the strut bolts at the base of the strut. In this case, I thought it would be easier to remove the control arm. I undo the nuts, pry the control arm down, remove the nut, and then pull on the steering knuckle and then rotate the strut assembly to the side. After I've removed the strut assembly to the side, I'm going to pry off the transaxle and the CV axle there and pop the CV axle out. With the old CV axle out, I'm now going to install the new CV axle, and I want to be careful not to damage the seal and move the CV axle into the splines of the transaxle, and then I'm going to push on the CV axle till it snaps into place. Next, I'm going to remove the nut, the retaining clip, and I'm going to reverse procedure. I'm going to slide the steering knuckle around and line up the splines with the CV axle and the splines with the hub assembly so that I can get the nut started on the CV axle to tighten the CV axle into place. After I have threaded the nut on a few revolutions, I can push the CV axle into place into the hub assembly, forcing it in so then that way I know that it's seated properly. After I've pushed that into place, you can see there, I want to look up the torque specifications to make sure that I tighten the bolts properly. We have put the control arm back into place with the ball joint, and we are tightening the bolts for the ball joint and getting them up against the control arm. After they're against the control arm, we're going to torque those control arm bolts that are attached to the ball joint. Make sure that they're torqued properly. Next, I'm going to take the tie rod and move it down through the steering knuckle. I'm going to now take the castle nut of the tie rod, thread it on by hand, then tighten it into place. You can use an impact tool or you can use a ratchet. Once the bolt is tightened into place, I'm going to tighten it with a torque wrench, and if the bolt hole lines up with the cotter pin, we're good. If it doesn't, tighten it a little tighter. Next, I'm going to tighten the CV axle down into place with the impact wrench to get the proper torque. Because I don't have an assistant, I'm using a punch. And the punch is between the brake caliper bracket and the fin of the rotor. And then I'm tightening the bolt to specification. So if you don't have an assistant to push on the brake pedal, you can use this punch between the brake caliper and the rotor, and then we just rotate the rotor after we're done back. The retainer for the nut is now installed, and then I'm going to put a new cotter pin down into place. And once the pin is pushed in, next I'm going to pry on the cotter pin and bend it up on both sides. So then that way, as I'm driving down the road, the retainer and cotter pin will hold the nut on securely, so I don't have to worry about the CV axle coming loose. These are a couple of examples that came into the shop. This CV axle boot is broken. We ended up replacing the CV axle, and you can see the elements is exposed. This particular CV axle broke, and you can see I'm spinning the wheel and the shaft is not turning and it's loose.